Hello, my lovely listeners. Are you back again? I was so sure that I'd frightened you away last time, but it seems not. Oh, did you bring a friend with you? I certainly hope so. It could be a little spooky here in the shadows, and you might need your friend to hold your hand. And here you thought you'd been lured in by that wailing woman out on White Cliff Rock. Not sure where I'm talking about? Maybe you should go investigate. And speaking of investigation, let's speak of last episode's stories. What did you think? Which one did you feel was the real story? I know you're on tenterhooks, waiting for me to reveal which one is real, but it's so fun making you wait and see. After all, the longer we're out here, the closer they come. Who was that, you might ask? Just a friend of my own. Don't worry about them. Yet. All right, I guess I could be nice and go ahead and tell you which is the real story. Peavy Switch Road is the actual name of the road, and yes, my grandmother did live down it. The way I described it is exactly how it used to be once upon a time. However, as people have come through there and bought the property, they've built houses, and it's nowhere near as spooky as it used to be when I was a child. As for the story of Peavy Switch Road, I can't honestly say that it is real. My brother told me the story ages ago when I was just a child, and believe me, he did an incredible job of terrifying not only me, but my cousins. I will say that there is one part that is true about the story. There was a crazy man who lived out in that direction ages ago, and by ages I do mean well over a century. Yes, there is a news article about him. Where that news article is now, I couldn't tell you, and I haven't had the guts yet to ask my brother about it. The man apparently did kill his family, and he blamed Native American spirits who roamed out through those woods near his home. So the story goes in the news article. But since I haven't seen that story myself, I can't 100% say that it is true. Are you curious to see if it is a true story? Maybe you should take a drive down Peavy Switch Road and see if you find an interesting or terrifying axe murderer. Let us turn our attention instead to the house on Ann Street. Yes, this is a real house, and no, Ann Street is not the name of the actual street. Yes, I did live in this house, and it was closer to 8 years that I existed there. And I call it existing because I didn't exactly love living there. Much creepier things did happen in that house, but they were so vague and so random that I simply couldn't put them in the story easily. One of those circumstances was my husband seeing that tall figure growing long limbs. I also mentioned that the funeral home behind our house was non-intrusive and didn't seem scary, but I have a feeling that some of the hauntings we endured were actually because of that place. I'm sure I'll tell you those stories later. Or it may show up on my Patreon in the future. I'm not sure as of yet. However, there is another area I would love to talk about. Are you familiar with Nacogdoches? Nacogdoches is the oldest town in Texas, and it has quite a few stories to stir the senses. That's why this episode is titled Dear Old Nac. Our first story is You Have to Love Mound Street. Most people who have lived in Nacogdoches know all about Mound Street. They've had to visit the area either to see a doctor or they have a friend who lives on that road. But there's a reason why it's been named Mound Street. It's an actual mound, as in Caddo burial ground type of mound. Those who have driven along downtown Nacogdoches already are familiar with the swells of the roads. It's not sharp enough to really bother anybody, admittedly, but nobody really thinks about why those slight inclines are there. I was lucky enough to take part of 2 different paranormal adventures. One of them was at the Hotel Fredonia and one was at the local cemetery. Both Hotel Fredonia and Oak Grove Cemetery are very close to Mound Street, where people have said that they've seen figures walking along the street. Oak Grove Cemetery was built back in the early 1800s. And if you're a history lover, it is definitely worth visiting in the daytime. In the nighttime, however, things seem to change around the area. But I'm jumping ahead of myself here. A good 10 or so years ago, I was part of an investigation group, and we'd heard that the Hotel Fredonia was haunted by a good number of spirits. There were rumors that housekeepers were changing sheets in empty rooms and would later come back to the same room only to find that the sheets had been messed up. There were also stories of people hearing music, soft, sweet, and eerie. It was playing from rooms that were empty and had no radio. But most people like to talk about floors 2 and 6, where most of the hauntings seemed to reside. There were tales of shadows and hearing whistles in the hallways. In fact, it's believed that Happy Jack, the resident ghost of floor 2, is the reason for the shadows and whistles, and one of the workers desperately wanted proof of this. They reached out to Jimmy, the head of our organization, asking if we would come investigate. The holdup was they didn't want to tell the manager since the manager was forbidding of such things. After all, in the manager's opinion, Hotel Fredonia was not allowed to be haunted. It was eventually agreed upon that we would come on a weekday night when the manager wouldn't be there and there would be few guests in the hotel. We would come in the back entrance and we would sneak up to the second level so we could do our beginning investigation. And so, with our equipment and bags, we went into the hotel, and as soon as we stepped in, Sean, the youngest of us, said, "Whoa, can you feel that? It's almost like there's a change whenever you walk in here." His fiancée Megan said she didn't feel anything, and as she was our medium at the time, it was rather strange that he would feel something and she wouldn't. However, her demeanor about the hotel changed as soon as we got to the second floor. And it wasn't because of a ghost. As soon as we got off the elevators, we spied a guest that was coming out of the room. The guest looked us up and down, slowly turned around, and walked back into their room. And since Megan was already cautious about going into a haunted hotel without the manager's permission, she was already edgy about being there. We immediately began to placate her, telling her that the guest probably forgot something in their room, that there was no reason to worry about the other staff or manager, and it was Jimmy who said, even if the manager did show up, all they can do is ask us to leave, nothing more. Megan wasn't convinced, and she seemed rather adamant about leaving, which meant that Sean would be leaving as well if that was the case. An argument likely would have broken out except for a long, sharp whistle echoing through the hallway. It immediately shut us up. As Megan walked along the hallway with her hand extended forward, we each began to take pictures of the area, especially the doorways, hoping that we might catch something. Jimmy and her husband Walter pulled their EVPs out and began recording as they asked questions. Meanwhile, I had my EMF reader out and was calling out any time it would bounce upward. We had only been there about maybe 10 minutes at that point whenever the manager showed up to tell us that we weren't guests and we weren't permitted to stay on the property unless we got a hotel room. We were disappointed at being shut down so quickly and agreed that the night was a bust there at Hotel Fredonia for now, but there was still a cemetery nearby and there had been rumors of that area being haunted as well. As I said before, people had said they'd seen shadows and figures walking along the street along Mound Street. They also said the same thing about Lananya Street and on Oak Grove Cemetery Road, which drove right through the cemetery. The tombstones that are in the cemetery are beautiful, and the statues that are on them are magnificent. In the nighttime, however, they take on an eerie quality. Since the cemetery was only a block and a half at best away, we drove down the road and parked along the edge of the cemetery so we could open the gate. It was still early enough in the evening that our being there wasn't exactly forbidden, but it was also strange for people to be walking into a cemetery at night. It was also rather obvious what we were up to. We drove around the cemetery first, just to make sure everything was okay first, and then we parked over there by the Oak Grove Cemetery Church. It's a lovely building and definitely worth visiting. As soon as we parked our vehicle and got out, we immediately heard somebody say, "Shh, they're here." The voice was that of an elderly woman, and none of us were over our 40s, so it definitely couldn't have been any of us. Not only that, but the voice seemed to have come from a group of trees nearby. With our flashlights out, we went to investigate along the group of trees and found nothing. But our excitement was now up. While Jimmy and Walter began to take pictures, I began to ask questions in hopes that I would record something. Later on, I would find that I would get whispers. Unfortunately, the whispers were so very soft I couldn't make out any of the words, and so they were useless. Any naysayers who listened to the recordings would say that they were whispers of fabric or mere street sounds from the nearby roads. What we did catch on camera was far more interesting, however. Mind you, this was near the end of July, right before August when everybody returned back for school, so it was rather dead in downtown Nacogdoches. Pun not intended. There on the camera, we caught a wisp of something moving from one gravestone to another. The figure was tall and looked like a woman in a gown moving about. Another figure was a mere shadow lurking behind a gravestone. It looked almost like a child hiding behind the gravestone, as if the child were hiding from us in fear and uncertain of our actions or intent out there that night. Most unsettling of the photos we took that night would be that of a tall, skeletal, spectral figure that hovered over a statue of a saint. Luckily, we didn't see it that night. Otherwise, I think all of us would have run from that cemetery screaming. We found it days later, and we actually went back out there later on to research that saint, as well as to see if we could pick up any residual traces of that specter. As for that night, we got quite a few readings out there. There were spikes on the EMF reader, and of course we had the whispers that couldn't be explained. That was another reason for us wanting to go back out there. We spent a couple of hours out there doing what we could and getting what information we could from the area. Then we loaded everything back up and went over to IHOP to discuss what we'd heard, what we'd seen, and what we felt. At one point, Megan said that something had been following us and was curious about us. She said she also didn't get a good feeling from whatever it was. Sean said that he'd heard somebody whispering behind him, and there was a few times it kept asking, "What do you want?" There was one stone in particular, and I wish I could remember the name of the person there. Walter said that he had been standing there asking questions, and he felt something or somebody press at his back. It was a brief touch, but it was firm, and when he turned around expecting his wife to be there, he realized he was all alone. The next day, he would realize that he had scratches along his lower back. Funnily enough, I have another friend who also does paranormal research. She's gone out to that same cemetery and she's done a few investigations. She has also seen dark shadows that lurk around the cemetery and has even seen demon dogs. If you don't know what that is, you should look that up. There's even been rumors that the church acts as an unintentional portal for spirits to come through. Whether that's true or not, I couldn't attest to that since I've never been in the church. We have all ventured back out to that same cemetery and we've done other readings. We haven't had the same results as before. Maybe we just got lucky that night, or maybe something had followed us from Hotel Fredonia and had stirred up the other spirits. Once I do find my photos from Oak Grove Cemetery, I will be putting them up on the Facebook group page. I will also suggest to any paranormal investigators who do decide to go to either Hotel Fredonia or the Oak Grove Cemetery, please proceed with caution. Something I've learned from my years as a paranormal investigator, something can latch onto you and it can follow you home. And this area was once the home of the Caddo people. When the Spanish priests came in and began to teach them about their religion, suddenly the Caddo had to deal with persecution. They were infected with unknown diseases they had never come across before. And even immigrants who moved from the north down to Texas had to deal with that same sort of infection and disease that they'd never experienced before, being so close to swampy water as they were. Will I ever go back to either location? Oh, in a heartbeat. Not only is there a lot of history and quite a few haunted places there in Nacogdoches, but also the town is a delightful place to spend time at. The Brick Street area, which is known as Main Street, has quite a few shops that can be visited. There's also the Fredonia Brewery. If you're ever in the area, you should stop by. Every now and then they have trivia nights or they have other games that they do. They have live bands. And let's not forget the bed and breakfasts that are in the area and the festivals that tend to go on in Nacogdoches. Aside from that is the Lanana Creek Trail. This trail is about 6.9 miles and it goes through the downtown area to the North Loop. It used to be a Native American footpath. Apparently, one of the stories is that there's a well or pond out there that has certain mystic capabilities that can heal you. Whether this is true or not, I have yet to find out. I will end the first story with a final surprising moment, and it happened to me. As we were loading up our gear into the van, I had turned around to put a last box in place. As I did, I could have sworn I saw a cat moving toward us. The creature was darting around a tree and suddenly wasn't there. Whenever we got in the vehicle and we began to pull out, there was a cat again darting across the road. I yelled for Walter to stop the vehicle for fear he would hit the animal. He came to a halt and we got out to look for the cat. Nobody had seen anything. Later on, I would find out there's a cat that haunts that area and it's commonly seen darting around that road. And yes, I have seen it on a few occasions whenever I go to visit Nacogdoches. My second story is titled, I Hate Working There Alone. Close to Mound Street was a law office that I worked for many years. I was told as soon as I started there that the place was haunted. I didn't believe my new co-workers, but then they started coming forward with stories. At the time, there was only 4 of us working there, and the law office was in an old house built in the 70s. Not that the age of the house mattered, honestly, when we already had spirits roaming the area freely. As I said before, Mound Street was part of the land that belonged to the Caddo people. And when Spanish settlers moved into the area, they brought with them the social and economic lifestyles that they wanted to share with the Caddo. Things like government and religious practices and education, but as they brought indoctrination, they also brought diseases. As the Spanish attempted to not only indoctrinate and conform the Caddo, they began to kill them off in multiple ways, unfortunately. And wouldn't you know it, but my law office was in an area that was close to a former church that the Spanish had built. The building had been razed centuries before, but the bodies of those who were taken down either by disease or by the church for not conforming were still left behind, sometimes in unmarked graves. So when my coworkers began to tell me stories about the crying lady or the little boy that hid in the corner of the bathroom or the man with the heavy shoes, I may not have wanted to believe them, but that didn't mean that there wasn't something there. As I began to get comfortable with the law office myself, I began to see and hear things. What they didn't tell me about was the lady who liked to hum. I had been there maybe a month whenever I heard the humming for the first time. I assumed it was one of my co-workers finally getting to work. Since I was the one that got there at 8 o'clock and the others at 9, it was pretty common for me to stay there at the office for at least an hour alone. It was around 7:50, so I had barely gotten there and gotten to my station whenever I heard the humming coming down the hallway. I called down the hallway, "Hey, Amanda, you sure are in early. You sound like you're in a good mood, too. What are you humming?" When Amanda didn't deign to answer me, I got up from my station to go check in on her. I checked her office, and of course she wasn't there. I went to each of the other rooms looking for her, and nobody was in there either. I was confused about how I could have missed her whenever it struck me a moment later that I'd not heard any footsteps. As I said before, the building was once a house. It had a crawl-space foundation and wooden flooring. That meant that whenever you walked in certain areas, the floorboards would creak. Even if Amanda had wanted to creep down that hallway, she wouldn't have had the chance. There would have been so many creaks. I was disconcerted by that realization, and when Amanda showed up to work around 9:15 or so, I let her know that I'd heard a woman humming in the back office. "Oh yeah, I don't think we told you about her. We think it's the same woman who cries," is what Amanda told me. As if on cue, we heard crying coming from the nearby bathroom. And seeing as Amanda and I were the only 2 in the building at the time, we knew that neither of us could be making the sound. It would be months later before I had another occurrence happen. Again, I was there early in the office, alone, and I began to hear heavy thuds coming from the rooftop. This went on for minutes, and the odd thuds began to make their way toward me. The closer they got, the more terrified I became until I finally ran out of the building. Once I got to the sidewalk, I turned around and noticed that our caretaker was on the roof blowing off leaves, and he was watching me. To say that I was mortified is an understatement. I went back into the building with some lame excuse thrown at him and settled back at my desk. It wasn't long after that I heard him get in his truck and leave. I knew I still had some time before the others got to work, and I wanted to shake off the mortification before they got there, so I buried myself in my paperwork, and whenever I heard heavy footsteps coming from the back door, I immediately lifted my head and said, "Oh, are you back, John?" I hadn't heard his truck pull back up, but I knew it was still too early for my coworkers to get there, so I just made the assumption that he'd come back for something. The footsteps came to a halt, then resumed their trek from the back door through the library and up to my desk. There the footsteps came to a halt again, and the hairs on the back of my neck began to stand. Nothing more happened after that, but I did hear that sound on quite a few occasions after that, and there were a couple of times that there was a knock at the front door and nobody was there. I'm almost certain that Spirit was having fun with me. The footsteps were rather heavy like a male's, and I have the feeling he was deciding I needed to get up from the desk, and that was his way of making me do that. There were even times that we smelled a strong cigar stench coming through the building. The stench of the cigar seemed to follow along that same path as the footsteps, so we concluded that it was the same spirit. As for the child that hid in the bathroom, I never saw that spirit. I did see shadows drifting from that room to the back office. Since there was nobody in the back office, there was no reason for a shadow to be drifting back there, and yet we would all see it. In time, one of the legal partners of the office decided to move to a different location. The upheaval of his leaving seemed to waken a new spirit. This one almost made me quit on a couple of occasions. I called this one the Growler. When the other legal partner and a secretary left, we cleaned up the stations that they'd had, and we decided to turn her office into a small kitchen for ourselves. It was pretty common for us to go back there, make ourselves a nice cup of coffee or tea, and maybe have a cookie or two. It was my coworker Maria who had the first encounter with the Growler. She'd been in the newly furnished break room and had been having herself a snack. It couldn't have been more than maybe 5 minutes before she came running to that room, to my office. She was pale and out of breath as she asked me, "Did you hear that?" I was taken aback by the question as I asked her, "Did I hear what?" It took Maria a moment to explain that she'd been in the break room peeling herself a banana when she thought she'd heard someone come in the room with her. Assuming that one of us had joined her in the break room, she didn't think anything about the sound, but then something or someone stood behind her and growled. She whipped around with the idea that one of us had come in the room and was being playful, but when she turned around to rebuke us and found nobody there, it startled her. She told me what had really scared her was the fact that the growl happened again right in her face. She told me that she could actually feel the air on her cheeks as if somebody had released a breath into her face. It wouldn't be the only time that this would happen to one of us. In fact, there was a certain closet in the hallway we began to avoid because of the heavy sensation that it carried. Since it was mostly used for storage anyway, there was no reason for us to get into that closet. Unfortunately, our lawyer needed an old case file that was stored in there, and he'd sent Amanda to go rooting around through the old cases. I can't say how long Amanda was in that closet. I do know she came stumbling up to my desk a while later. She was pale and gasping for air. She said it felt like something was constricting her lungs being in that closet. Worse than that, she was shaking from head to toe intensely. In fact, she was sweating and looked downright feverish. From that point, if anything was needed out of that closet, then 2 of us would go in there. Not only did it make the searching faster, but anytime we would hear the growl, we both knew that it was time to get out of the closet and go back to work somewhere else. Looking back on that, I have to wonder if that presence was demonic. Anytime we would get near its domain, it was threatening us to go away. The growling entity luckily didn't last there for very long. At best, it was there for possibly 6 to 8 months. But what unnerved me so much about that entity is not only that it growled to where you could feel it in your face or you could feel the hairs on the back of your neck stir, insects would start appearing. In one instance, I kept hearing something click against one of the windows in my office. On a previous occasion, I'd had a click beetle that kept tapping against the window, and I assumed that's what it was. However, when I went to investigate, there was nothing there, and I could hear the clicking right in front of me. This happened about 2 or 3 different times, and each time it would happen, I would suddenly be interested in another area of the office. I also got very interested in playing my music loud until somebody else showed up for work. Maybe since that entity was being ignored, that's what convinced him to move away faster. As for the other spirits, I'm sure they're still there. Unfortunately, I joined another company a few years later, and that law office closed down. I still talk to Amanda from time to time, and sometimes we'll bring up stories about that place. Every time we do, we end up scaring each other. Ghosts aside, that was still one of the most pleasant jobs I ever had. But it seems, dear friends, the sun has finally set the rest of the way and the shadows have dragged on. And that little friend I spoke of earlier has decided to come up very close and is very curious about you. You may meet them later in your sleep. Who's to say? Only you will find out. And be sure you come back for the next episode. There's still that issue of shadow people. Did you honestly think they weren't lurking here with us? Oh, my silly friend, if only you knew. And if you haven't already, you should go to our Facebook page, Hidden in the Shadows. I'll make sure to have the link available for you. Why is it hidden in the shadows? Because there's always something hiding in the shadows, my dear friend. We're simply sitting here in the shadows, waiting and watching. As always, my dear friend, thank you for coming to sit with me for a spell. I do wish you a good night. Sleep tight. Don't let the ghouls bite. And have the most unpleasant of dreams.